Abstract Labor and Value in Marx's System by Isaak Illich Rubin. This is originally reprinted in Capital and Class in 1978, but was originally published in Russian in 1927. This is an introduction from Capital and Class. The lecture develops one of the main themes of Rubin's essays on Marx's theory of value, thus providing a useful introduction to the latter work, while developing beyond it in important respects. The lecture aims to bring out more clearly than had the essays the distinction between the social commensurability of labor that is characteristic of any society that is based on the division of labor, and the specific form in which this commensuration is achieved in a capitalist society, the form of abstract labor. The lecture thus centers on a further investigation of the concept of the form of value and brings out particularly clearly the significance of the distinctions between value and exchange value and between abstract and embodied labor, as well as contributing to the debate about the methodology of capital. At the time the lecture was given, these issues were of greatest political significance, for in the period of the new economic policy, when Rubin's influence was at its greatest, the question of the applicability of the law of value under socialism, and so the proper understanding of the concept of value, was of the utmost importance to the future development of the Soviet Union. Despite the already intensifying repression, it was therefore still possible to examine the foundations of Marxism. With the abandonment of the new economic policy and the switch to the general line, such critical examination became increasingly intolerable for the Soviet state as heterodoxy in theory came to be identified with economic sabotage and foreign intervention in the subversion of established state policy. Thus, Rubin, along with other leading Marxist theorists whose work have recently been rediscovered, like Pashukanis and Volosinov, fell victim to the purges in the 1930s. A biographical note. Isaak Illich Rubin was born in 1896. He joined the Bund in 1904 and became a member of its Central Committee. He later joined the Mensheviks and was elected to their Central Committee in the autumn of 1920. Trained originally as a lawyer, his handbooks on conciliation and arbitration and on unemployment insurance were published by the Moscow Soviet in 1917-18. Rubin was imprisoned by the GPU in 1923 to 1924, from 1923 to 1924, in the roundup of Mensheviks. On his release, he dropped his political work to concentrate on his academic studies and teaching. From 1926 to 30, he was a research associate at the Marx Engels Institute under David Ryazanov, to whom he was very close, becoming one of the most influential interpreters of Marx's work. During this period, he published several books, one called Contemporary Economists in the West, Classics of Political Economy from the 17th to mid-19th centuries, A History of Economic Thought, History of Class Struggles, Essays on Marx's Theory of Value, and co-edited Fundamental Problems of Political Economy. Rubin's former association with Menshevism led to his arrest in December 1930 and his inclusion in the Menshevik trial of March 1931, in which he was accused of collaboration with the supposed, quote, Union Bureau of the Central Committee of the RSDRP, end quote, financed and directed from abroad. The charges were ludicrous. The charges were ludicrous, and the evidence internally contradictory, and in a number of instances clearly false. However, Rubin, like the other accused, made a full confession of his, quote, guilt, a confession extracted by the use of sustained and extreme torture. The trial was designed as an object lesson to the Bolshevik right opposition and to the Trotskyists. Rubin was included in order to incriminate Ryazanov, who was sacked and expelled from the party as a result of Rubin's confession for treason to the party and direct aid to the Menshevik interventionists, end quote. In anticipation of his trial, Rubin was denounced in Bolshevik 2, 1930, by V. Milutin and D. Bavillin as follows, quote, I. Rubin is the ideologist and representative of the ideology of the theoreticians of the Second International in political economy. It is a great error to describe Isaac Illich Rubin as a fighter for orthodox Marxism against the, quote, social school, or to accept uncritically and with negligible reservations a number of his theoretical assertions as strictly Marxist, end quote. To the article was appended a statement announcing the complete cessation of press discussion of the views of Rubin and his followers. However, it proved necessary to publish further diatribes by Bovelin in Pravda in its issue of poorly written date. I'm going to say it's March 1st, 1931, and July 3rd, 1931. The first called, quote, let us tear out Rubin's China by the roots, end quote. Rubin was sentenced to 5 years in jail. After 3 years in solitary confinement, he was exiled to Turgai and then to Aktubinsk, where he worked as a plan economist in the consumer cooperative and continued his own work. Arrested again in 1937, Rubin was transferred from Aktubinsk and disappeared for good. As a recent Soviet philosopher, Rosenthal, has observed, quote, the Communist Party has destroyed this tendency, which is quite alien to Marxism, and assisted Soviet philosophers and economists to unmask its essence, end quote. We are very pleased to publish Rubin's, quote, mischief here. Drink time. Comrades, this is the actual piece now. Comrades, I have chosen abstract labor and value as the theme of my lecture for 2 reasons. Firstly, I know that the question of abstract labor and the form and content of value has been the subject of heated debate in your seminars. Because of this, I decided to organize my lecture in such a way that I may deal with the problem of abstract labor in detail, while covering the question of value, its form and content at the same time. The second reason which persuaded me to select this theme is that it is the central problem of all Marxist theory. We do not term the theory, quote, labor theory of value for nothing. The name alone indicates that the main problem of the theory is the question of the reciprocal relationship between labor and value. What is the labor which creates or determines value? What is the value which is created or determined by labor? That is the main problem of Marxist theory, which I hope to illuminate in my lecture. Before we move to the essential part of the question, I should like to make a few remarks on methodology. By what method do we intend to set about solving this problem? In the introduction to a critique of political economy, the introduction to the Grundrisse, Marx observed that an economic investigation can be conducted according to 2 methods, by the transition from the concrete to the abstract, and conversely by the movement from the abstract to the concrete. The former, the analytical method, consists in taking a complex concrete phenomenon as the starting point of the investigation and selecting a single or several of the most important characteristics, disregarding the multiplicity of its features, and so making the transition from the more concrete to the more abstract concept, to the simpler or thinner concept, as Marx says. But further analysis will show, by further analysis, by further analysis, we move on from this concept to an even simpler concept, until we have reached the most abstract concepts in the particular science or the particular complex of questions which interest us. To cite just one example as an illustration of the problematic we are dealing with, I may remind you of the reciprocal relation between the following concepts. The Marxian theory of value builds on the concepts abstract labor, value, exchange value, and money. If we take money, the most complex and most concrete aspect of these concepts, and by examining the concept of money, make the transition to exchange value as the more general concept underlying money. If we then move from exchange value to value and from value to abstract labor, we are moving from the more concrete, to the more abstract concept, i.e., we are following the analytical method. But Marx says, however necessary the use of the analytical method is in the first stage of scientific inquiry, it cannot satisfy us in itself, and it must be complemented by another method. Once we have traced the complex phenomenon back to its basic elements by means of analysis, we have to take the opposite direction, and starting from the most abstract concepts, show how these develop to lead us on to more concrete forms, more concrete concepts. In our case, this progression from the simpler concepts to richer and more complex concepts would be the movement from abstract labor to value, from value to exchange value, and from exchange value to money. Marx calls this method genetic at one point because it enables us to follow the genesis and development of complex forms. Elsewhere, Marx terms it the dialectical. I hope we can also agree to describe the first method as the analytical, and the second, which includes both the analytical and the synthetic method, as dialectical. Marx indicates that he considers the dialectical method to be the only one which solves scientific questions satisfactorily. Accordingly, we have to subject the problem which interests us, the question of the relationship between labor and value, to investigation, not only by the analytical method, but by the dialectical method as well. Marx gives many examples to show in what respect the analytic method is adequate. I should like to quote 3 examples here. Concerning the theory of value, Marx says, quote, "Political economy has indeed analyzed, however incompletely, value and its magnitude, and it has discovered what lies beneath these forms. But it has never once asked the question why labor is represented by the value of its product, and labor time by the magnitude of that value." End quote. Capital, Volume 1, page 80. In another passage devoted to the theory of money, Marx says, quote, "In the last decades of the 17th century, it had already been shown that money is a commodity, but this step marks only the infancy of the analysis. The difficulty lies not in comprehending that money is a commodity, but in discovering how, why, and by what means a commodity becomes money." End quote. Here, as we see, the dialectical method differs once again from the analytical. Finally, at a further point, while discussing religion, Marx repeats the idea which he has stated before, that it is obviously much easier to discover by analysis the core of the curious religious concepts than conversely, it is to develop from the actual relations of real life the corresponding forms of those relations. The latter method is the only materialistic and consequently the only scientific one. End quote. Capital. Following Marx, we must solve our problem in this way. Our task does not only consist in showing that the value of a product can be attributed to labor. We must also show the converse. We must reveal how people's productive relations find their expression in value. This is the basic statement of the problem, which must be considered the most methodologically correct from the Marxian standpoint. If we put the question in this way, we take not the concept of value as the starting point of investigation, but the concept of labor. We define the concept of labor in such a way that the concept of value also follows from it. The requirements of the methodology already give us some indications as to the correct definition of the concept of labor. The concept of labor must be defined in such a way that it comprises all the characteristics of the social organization of labor, characteristics which give rise to the form of value, which is appropriate to the products of labor. A concept of labor from which the concept of value does not follow, and particularly a concept of labor in the physiological sense, i.e., the concept of labor which lacks all the features which are characteristic of its social organization and commodity production, cannot lead to the conclusion which we seek from the Marxian standpoint of the dialectical method. In the following, I shall try to show that the difference in conception between the sociological and the physiological understanding of abstract labor can in part be explained precisely by the distinction between the two methods, the dialectical and the analytical. Although the physiological conception of abstract labor can stand its ground more or less successfully from the standpoint of the analytic method, nevertheless it is doomed to failure from the start from the standpoint of the dialectic, since one cannot obtain from the concept of labor in the physiological sense any notion of value as the necessary social form of the product of labor. So we have to define labor in such a way that from labor and its social organization, we may understand the necessity of value as the basic social form which the products of labor assume in commodity production and the laws of the movement of value. Moving on to the analysis of labor, we will start with the most simple concept, with the concept of concrete or useful labor. Concrete labor is seen by Marx as labor in its useful activity, as labor which creates products which are necessary for the satisfaction of human needs. Labor viewed from this material technical side represents concrete labor. It is obvious that concrete labor does not interest us in the least, so long as we are speaking of the individual, of Robinson Crusoe overcoming nature, since the object of our science is not the production of a single individual, but social production, the production of a whole group of people, which is organized on the basis of a specific social division of labor. The system of the social division of labor is the totality of the various concrete kinds of labor, which are unified in a determined system and complement one another materially. So we have made the transition from concrete labor in general to the system of the social division of labor as the totality of the various concrete kinds of labor. We have to inquire more closely into the concept of the social division of labor, since it plays a key role in understanding the whole of Marx's theory of value. Marx says that the system of the social division of labor can occur in twofold form, as he terms it, as a system which is mediated through exchange, and as a system which has no need of such mediations, for example, the natural economy of a large clan or of a socialist community, etc. We may look first at the system of organized social division of labor, which is developed without exchange. So long as one speaks of an organized system of the social division of labor, we have not only concrete material technical labor, but social labor as well. In Marx, the concept of the social division of labor is on the border between the concept of concrete useful labor and social labor and social production. On the one hand, at the beginning of the section on the twofold character of labor, Marx examines the social division of labor as the totality of the concrete modes of labor. Elsewhere in Capital, particularly in the chapter on manufacture, he examines the system of the social division of labor from the standpoint of the human relations of production which characterize this system. In organized production, the relations among people are relatively simple and transparent. Labor assumes a directly social form, i.e., there is a determined social organization and determined social organs, which distribute the labor among the individual members of society, whereby the labor of each person enters directly into social production as concrete labor, with all its concrete material characteristics. The labor of each person is social, specifically because it differs from the labor of the other members of the society and represents a material complement to them. Labor is directly social in its concrete form. At the same time, it is also divided labor. For the social organization of labor consists in labor being distributed among the individual members of the society, and conversely, the division of labor being the act of a social organ. Labor is both social and divided, and possesses these characteristics in its material, technical, concrete, or useful form also. Let us now ask this question. Is the labor in an organized community also socially equated? Do we find a process which we could describe as a social process of equation of labor in this community? There are various views on this particular problem. Some economists maintain that this kind of social equation of labor already exists in any production community, which is based on the division of labor, and in a form which does not differ in essence from the equation of labor in commodity production. Other economists take the opposite view, saying that the process of social equation of labor is a process which is only appropriate to commodity production and occurs in no other form of production. In particular, these economists deny the possibility and necessity for social equation of labor in a socialist economy. I've suggested a middle road in my book. I pointed out that every production which rests on the division of labor has recourse to social equation of the labor of different kinds and different individuals, to some extent and in one form or another. I also pointed out in connection with this that the equation of labor acquires a very particular social form in commodity production and therefore makes way for the appearance of a completely new category, that of abstract labor. I think that Marx regarded the question in this way, although we have no clear statement by him on the subject. I know of one very explicit observation which dates already from the first edition of Capital. There he says, quote, "In every social form of labor, the labors of the various individuals are related to each other also as human labors. But here, this relation itself counts as the specifically social form of the labors." End quote. Capital. We will analyze the end of this sentence at a later point. For the present, I only want to establish that Marx clearly thought that in every social form of labor, the labor of single individuals is related as human labor. It is correct that extreme adherents of the physiological version could maintain that Marx meant here only the physiological equality of the various kinds of labor. But this interpretation seems to me too far-fetched. Both the actual sense of the particular sentence, which speaks of the, quote, social form of labor, end quote, as well as its relation to many other places in capital, indicate that Marx meant here the process of social equation of labor. I think it is necessary to add a certain qualification to the formula that social equation of labor occurs in any social form of production. I think that in the ancient family, for instance, where the labor was divided between man and woman and was tied to the representative of each sex, where the change from male labor to female did not exist and was even forbidden, the process of social equation of labor could not take place even in embryonic form. Further, in social organizations which were based on extreme inequality of the various social strata, for example, slavery, the social equation of labor could only occur for the members of a specific social group. For example, slaves or for a specific category of slaves. Even the concept of labor as such, as social function, could not be acquired in this kind of society. If we then leave aside social organization, which was based on extreme inequality of the sexes or of individual groups, and turn to a large community with division of labor, for example, the kind found in the large family associations of the Southern Slavs, I think that here the process of social equation of labor was necessary. It becomes all the more necessary in a large socialist community. But this process of the equation of labor in an organized community differs essentially from the process which occurs in commodity production. Let us actually imagine some socialist community where labor is distributed among the members of the society. A determined social organ equates the labor of different kinds and of different individuals, since without this organ there could be no economic planning. But in a community of this kind, the process of equation of labor is secondary and only complementary to the process of socialization and division of labor. Labor is primarily social and divided. The characteristic of socially equalized labor belongs here as derivative or supplementary. The main characteristic of labor is its social and divided aspect, and its socially equated aspect is an additional feature. I may take this opportunity to say that for the sake of clarity, I would find it useful to distinguish between three concepts of equal labor: physiologically equal labor, socially equated labor, abstract labor as used by Marx, or preferably abstract universal labor, a term which Marx uses in the Critique. A little burpsy there. The physiological homogeneity of the various modes of labor existed in all historical epochs, and the possibility that individuals may change over from one occupation to another is the prerequisite for any social division of labor. Socially equated labor is characteristic for all systems with the social division of labor. That is not only for commodity production, but for instance for a socialist community. Finally, the third concept of labor of labor as abstract universal is characteristic only for commodity production. We will come into this concept. So far, we have only discussed the second concept of labor as socially equated and divided. Let's take a look at the changes which will take place in the organization of labor in our community. if we imagine it not in the form of an organized whole, but in the form of a combination of individual production units of private commodity producers, that is, in the form of commodity production. In commodity production, we also find the social characteristics of labor specified above, which we observed earlier in an organized community. Here too we will find social labor, divided labor, and socially equated labor. But all these socialization processes of equation and division of labor, occur in a totally different form. The interrelation between the three characteristics is now completely different, primarily because in commodity production the direct social organization of labor is missing, and labor is not directly social. In commodity production, the labor of an individual, a single commodity producer, is not directly regulated by the society, and in itself, in its concrete form, it does not yet belong to social production. Labor only becomes social in commodity production when it assumes the characteristic of socially equated labor. The labor of every commodity producer only becomes social by virtue of the fact that his product is assimilated with the products of all other commodity producers. Sorry, I spaced out for a second. Labor only becomes social in commodity production when it assumes the characteristic of socially equated labor. The value of every commodity producer only becomes social by virtue of the fact that his product is assimilated with the products of all the other commodity producers. And the labor of a specific individual is thus assimilated with the labor of all the other members of the society and all the other kinds of labor. There is no other characteristic for the definition of the social character of labor in commodity production. There is no previously conceived plan for the socialization of the division of labor. And the only indication that the labor of a particular individual is included within the social system of production is the exchange of the product of a specific labor for any other product. So in comparison with the socialist community, the characteristics of social labor and of equated labor have exchanged roles in commodity production. Previously, the characteristic labor as equal or equated was the result of the secondary process, of the derived act of a social organ, which socialized and distributed labor. Now labor only becomes social in the form in which it is equated with all other kinds of labor, and it becomes thus socially equated labor. I should like to quote a few statements by Marx which should confirm this view. The most unequivocal example can be found in the Critique, where Marx says that labor only becomes social, quote, by assuming the form of labor's direct opposite, of abstract universal labor, end quote. That is, the form of equation with all other kinds of labor. Quote, abstract, and in that form social labor, end quote. Marx frequently characterized the social form of labor in commodity production with these words. I may also call to mind the well-known passage from Capital, which states that in commodity production, quote, the specific social character of private labor carried on independently consists in the equality of every kind of that labor by virtue of its being human labor, end quote. Capital. So in commodity production, the emphasis of the social characteristic of labor shifts from the attribute of socialized labor to that of equal or socially equated labor. which only becomes socially equalized labor through the equation of the products of labor. The concept of the equality of labor plays an important role in Marxian value theory, precisely because in commodity production, labor becomes social only in its quality of being equal labor. Like the characteristic of social labor, the characteristic of divided labor also follows from the equality of labor in commodity production. The division of labor in commodity production does not consist in its conscious distribution corresponding to determined, previously expressed needs, but is regulated by the principle of the equal advantage of production. The division of labor between individual branches of production takes place in such a way that in all branches of production, the commodity producers receive an equal sum of value through expenditure of an equal quantity of labor. We established the three characteristics of labor as being social labor, socially equated labor, and divided labor. All these characteristics also appertain to labor in a socialist society, but completely change their character and their interrelationship as compared with commodity production. The three characteristics of labor which we listed here are the basis from which the three aspects of value develop. Marx considers value as the unity of the form of value, the substance of value, and the magnitude of value. Quote, "The crucially important task, however, was to discover the inner necessary interrelationship between the form of value, the substance of value, and the magnitude of value." End quote. The unity of the form, substance, and magnitude of value reflects the unity of labor as social, socially equated, and quantitatively divided. In commodity production, the relations of labor and of production are, quote, objectified, and the social characteristics of labor assume the form of objectified attributes of the product of labor. The, quote, form of labor is the social form of the product of labor which reflects the particular social character of labor in commodity production. The, quote, substance of value represents socially equal labor. And finally, the, quote, magnitude of value is the expression of the social division of labor, or more precisely, of the quantitative side of the process of division of labor. The threefold character of labor, which we have suggested, helps us to explain the relationship which exists in the Marxian system between form, substance, and magnitude of value. In particular, this division clarifies some problems of the construction of Marx's section on the fetishism of commodities. Allow me to read out this section from the second paragraph. Quote, "For, in the first place, however varied the useful kinds of labor or productive activities may be, it is a physiological fact that they are functions of the human organization, and each such function, whatever may be its nature or form, is essentially the expenditure of human brain, nerves, muscles, etc. Secondly, with regard to that which forms the groundwork for the quantitative determination of value, namely the duration of that expenditure or the quantity of labor, it is quite clear that there is a palpable difference between its quantity and quality. Lastly, from the moment that men in any way work for one another, their labor assumes a social form." End quote. Capital Volume 1, page 71. In the 3 points quoted, Marx indicates that we can observe the three characteristics of labor, social, equal, and quantitatively divided, not only in commodity production, but also in other forms of production. But, says Marx, quote, whence then arises the enigmatical character of the product of labor so soon as it assumes the form of commodities, end quote. And he answers himself, obviously precisely from the form of commodities, in which the three characteristics of labor are already transformed, quote, reified in the value of the products of labor. Quote, the equality of all sorts of human labor is expressed objectively by their products all being equally valued. The measure of the expenditure of human labor power by the duration of that expenditure takes the form of the quantity of value of the products of labor. And finally, the mutual relations of the producers, within which the social character affirms itself, takes the form of a social relation between the products. End quote. Capital Volume 1. In these 3 points, Marx already speaks of the substance, the magnitude, and the form of value. His reasoning can be traced particularly clearly in the first edition of Capital, where the 3 sentences quoted are immediately followed by a whole page on the substance, magnitude, and form of value. In the second edition, the comments referring to the substance, magnitude, and form of value are apparently omitted by Marx. In reality, they were only deferred. The 3 paragraphs which precede the analysis of the various forms of production, Robinson's production, medieval production, etc., are devoted to the substance, the magnitude, and the form of value. We have now reached the conclusion that equal labor can mean, firstly, physiologically equal labor, which we have only briefly considered. Secondly, it can signify socially equated labor, and this kind of labor exists not only in commodity production, but also, let us say, in a socialist community or any other large community which is based on the social division of labor. And finally, there is abstract universal labor. That is, socially equated labor in the specific form appropriate to commodity production. Labor which becomes social and divided only by the process of social equation. Only this socially equated labor can be described as abstract or abstract universal. We should mention here that Marx makes several allusions to the 3 kinds of equation of labor in the Critique of Political Economy, which is the first one from the early, 1859 or 1860 or whatever, the contribution to the Critique of Political Economy. That is to physiological social equalization in general, and social equalization in commodity production. Marx does not draw any absolutely clear distinction, it is true. But we should point out that he does distinguish 3 terms: human labor, equal and abstract universal labor, and human labor, equal and abstract universal labor. I would not maintain that these 3 terms coincide with those which we characterized earlier as physiologically equal labor, socially equalized and abstract labor, but there are some points of contact nevertheless. In dealing with the problem of abstract labor, We cannot therefore stop at the preliminary characteristic of labor as physiologically equal, nor the characteristic of labor as socially equated. We have to make the transition from both these characteristics to a third, and investigate that specific form of equated labor, which is peculiar to commodity production, that is the system of social division of labor based on exchange. Consequently, not only are the followers of the physiological conception of abstract labor mistaken in our opinion, but also those comrades who understand abstract labor in general to mean socially equated labor, independent of the specific social form in which this equation occurs. We must add that the two concepts of labor, physiologically equated and socially equated, are frequently confused and not distinguished from one another sufficiently clearly. The concept of abstract universal labor naturally implies the physiological equality and the social equation of labor, but apart from these, it also contains the social equation of labor in the quite specific form which it takes in commodity production. We could give many quotations from Marx himself to show how he is crudely misconstrued by the followers of the physiological conception of abstract labor. I should like to read just one very characteristic quotation here. In his short sketch of Franklin's views, Marx says that Franklin unconsciously reduced all the forms of labor to one aspect, being uninterested in whether the labor was that of a shoemaker, a tailor, etc. Franklin believed that value is determined by, quote, abstract labor, which has no particular quality and can thus be measured only in terms of quantity, end quote. Franklin recognized abstract labor, but, Marx added, quote, since he does not explain that the labor expressed in exchange value is abstract universal social labor, which is brought about by the universal alienation of individual labor, Franklin is bound to mistake money for the direct embodiment of this alienated labor. End quote. Contribution to the critique of political economy. It is obvious here that Marx is contrasting abstract labor with abstract universal labor. The abstract universal labor, which is embodied in value, is the labor which is specifically appropriate to commodity production. We now reach the conclusion that if we analyze the problem of the relation between labor and value from the standpoint of the dialectical method, as well as the analytical, then we must take this concept of labor as the starting point and develop the concept of value from it. If we follow the analytical method, start out from value and ask ourselves what lies beneath this concept, we can certainly say that physiologically equal labor and socially equated labor are concealed beneath the value of products. But neither answer will be adequate since there is no way to make the transition from physiologically equal labor or from socially equated labor to value. In order to arrive at the concept of value dialectically from the concept of labor, we must also include in the concept of labor those features which characterize the social organization of labor in commodity production and necessitate the appearance of value as the particular social form of the product of labor. Consequently, this concept of abstract universal labor must be far richer than both the concept of the physiological equality of labor and the concept of the social equation of labor in general. End of section 1. Section 2. We move from physiologically equal labor to socially equated labor, and from socially equated to abstract universal labor. We enriched our definition of labor by new characteristics in the 3 stages of our investigation, and only when we moved on to the 3rd stage and defined labor as abstract universal, from which the category of value must necessarily follow, was it possible for us to move from labor to value? We could define abstract labor approximately as follows. Abstract labor is the designation of that part of the total social labor which was equalized in the process of social division of labor through the equation of the products of labor on the market. In my book, Essays on Marx's Theory of Value, I gave more or less this definition. I think it is necessary to add that the social nature of abstract labor is not limited by the fact that the concept of value necessarily follows from this concept. As I have already outlined in my book, the concept of abstract labor leads unconditionally to the concept of money, and from the Marxian standpoint, that is entirely consistent. In reality, we define abstract labor as labor, which was made equal through the all-round equation of all products of labor. But the equation of all the products of labor is not possible except through the assimilation of each one of those products of labor with a universal equivalent. Consequently, the product of abstract labor has the ability to be assimilated with all the other products only in the form that it appears as universal equivalent or can potentially be exchanged for a universal equivalent. One can see particularly clearly in the Critique of Political Economy, the book, that the concept of abstract labor is inseparably tied to that of the universal equivalent for Marx. There, Marx approaches the study of abstract labor as follows. As in Capital, Marx starts out from the commodity or value and uncovers analytically the abstract universal labor which lies beneath value. After he is moved by analysis from the equality of values to the equality of labor, he goes on to a detailed sociological characterization of this equal labor, or the, quote, social categories of labor. Quote, social in the particular sense, end quote, which is appropriate to commodity production. In commodity production, the social character of labor is expressed by, quote, the labor of the individual assuming the abstract form of universal labor, or his product assuming the form of universal equivalent, end quote. Quote, the universal labor time finds its expression in a universal product, a universal equivalent, end quote. Quote, the labor of an individual can produce exchange value only if it produces universal equivalence, end quote. As we can see, Marx links the category of abstract labor inseparably with the concept of the universal equivalent, or money. We therefore have to carry the social characterization of abstract labor still further and deeper, and not confine ourselves to the assimilation of labor through the equation of its products. We must add that labor becomes abstract through being assimilated with a particular form of labor, or through the assimilation of that labor's product with a universal equivalent, which was therefore regarded by Marx as the objectification or materialization of abstract labor. From this standpoint, an interesting parallel between Marx and Hegel opens up here. The term, quote, abstract universal itself, as we know, is reminiscent of Hegel, who distinguishes the abstract universal from the concrete universal. The distinction between the two can be reduced to the fact that the concrete universal does not exclude the differences between the objects, which are included within this universal aspect, while the abstract universal excludes such differences between objects. In order to understand why Marx describes the equated labor of commodity producers as the abstract universal, we have to compare the process of equation of labor in a socialist economy with the process of equation of labor in commodity production. We will notice the following distinction. Let us assume that some organ compares the various kinds of labor one with another in a socialist community. What happens here? This organ takes all these kinds of labor in their concrete useful form, since it links them in precisely this form, but it abstracts one of their aspects and says that these kinds of labor are equal to each other in the given circumstances. In this case, the equality appears as a characteristic of these concrete kinds of labor, as a characteristic which was abstracted from these forms. But this universal category of equality does not destroy their concrete difference, which manifests itself as useful labor. In commodity production, comparison of this kind is impossible, since there is no organ which consciously equates all these kinds of labor. The labor of a spinner and that of a weaver cannot be equated, so long as they are concrete useful labor. Their equation results only indirectly through the assimilation of each with the third form of labor, namely abstract universal labor. This determined kind of labor is abstract universal and not concrete universal, precisely because it does not include the distinctions between the various concrete kinds of labor, but precludes these divergences. This kind poses all the concrete kinds of labor in that it appears as their representative. The fact that in this case Marx intended the distinction between the abstract universal and the concrete labor, which occurs in Hegel, can be clearly seen in the first edition of Capital, where in general the traces of Hegelian concepts and Hegelian terminology stand out far more distinctly than in the second. Here there is a paragraph which reads, quote, "Within the value relation and the value expression included in the value relation, the abstractly general accounts not as a property of the concrete, sensibly real, but on the contrary, the sensibly concrete counts as the mere form of appearance, or definite form of realization of the abstractly general. This inversion by which the sensibly concrete counts only as the form of appearance of the abstractly general, and not on the contrary, the abstractly general as property of the concrete, characterizes the expression of value. At the same time, it makes understanding it difficult." End quote. At another point, Marx says, quote, "It is as if together with, and besides lions, tigers, and hares..." Okay, why can't it be bears, dude? Why does it have to be hares? Can't we just make it, why couldn't Marx have anticipated the Wizard of Oz and Judy Garland coming to being? So much be able... Sorry, I'm being an ass. Okay, at another point, Marx says, quote, It is as if together with and besides lions, tigers, hares, and all the other real animals, which as a group form the various genuses, species, subspecies, families, etc. of the animal kingdom, there also existed the animal, the individual incarnation of the whole animal kingdom. End quote. To decipher this statement by Marx, we must say that in commodity production, the abstract universal really appears not as characteristic or attribute of the concrete, the sensuous real, i.e., of the concrete modes of labor, since in order to abstract the specific universal features from these concrete modes of labor, it would need a unified organ, which does not exist in commodity production. The concrete kinds of labor are therefore not assimilated one with another through abstraction of some universal characteristics, but through comparison equation of each of these kinds with a particular determined concrete kind, which serves as a phenomenal form of universal labor. In order that concrete labor becomes universal, universal labor must appear in the form of concrete labor. Quote, if the individual's labor time represents universal labor time, or if universal labor time represents individual labor time. End quote. Critique of political economy. It is only in the light of these comments by Marx, which show clear traces of Hegel's influence, that we can understand the passages from the Critique, which we mentioned earlier, in which Marx says that labor only becomes social in commodity production by assuming the form of abstract universality. This idea is generally related to Marx's views on bourgeois society. In his earlier works, in the German ideology, for example, Marx expresses the idea that in bourgeois society, where a central social organization of production is lacking, it's a market society. Sorry, that's me. I'm sorry. Blah, blah, blah. The representation of the social relations always falls to some single organization, to a group of people, to a single class. The single social class declares its partial interest to be the interest of the whole society and lends its ideas, quote, the form of universality, end quote. The particular interest is expressed as the general interest, and the general as the dominant. If we compare these remarks by Marx in the Critique with those statements where he says that social labor assumes, quote, the abstract form of universality, and that the value of a commodity assumes the form of a particular determined commodity, the form of money, then the close ideal relationship of these concepts becomes evident. To conclude the problem of abstract labor, I must take up two criticisms which have been made against me, in particular by Dashkowski and by various other comrades. Might be Dashkovsky, but I don't know. The first criticism was that I apparently seek to substitute for abstract labor the process of abstraction from concrete characteristic attributes of labor. That is, that I seek to replace abstract labor with the social form of the organization of labor. Admittedly, a substitution of this kind, if it had really occurred, would deviate from Marx's theory. But we maintain that the character of people's relations of production and commodity production unconditionally means that labor, both in its qualitative and its quantitative aspect, finds its expression in value and in the magnitude of value of a commodity. If instead of abstract labor we take only the social form of the organization of labor, it would only help us to explain the, quote, form of value, i.e., the social form which a product of labor assumes. We could also explain why a product of labor assumes the form of a commodity which possesses a value. We would not know why this product assumes this given quantitatively determined value in particular. In order to explain value as the unity of the form of value, the substance of value and the magnitude of value, we have to start out from abstract labor, which is not only social and socially equated, but quantitatively divided. One can find formulations in Marx himself, which, if one chose, would be sufficient reason to say that Marx substituted the social form of labor for labor itself. Since it would be tedious to refer to the various points in Marx, I should just like to mention one passage which, if written by anyone but Marx, would sound heretical. The sentence runs, "The labor which posits exchange value is a specific social form of labor." In the same place, Marx says in a footnote that value is the social form of wealth. If one combines these two statements, then instead of the thesis that labor creates value, we have the thesis that the social form of labor produces the social form of wealth. Some critic would well say that Marx replaces labor completely with the social form of labor, which Marx obviously did not intend. I should now like to turn to the second criticism. It has been said that my explanations give rise to the impression that abstract labor is only produced in the act of exchange. One could conclude from this that value also is only created in exchange, whereas from Marx's standpoint, value and consequently abstract labor too must already exist in the process of production. This touches on the profound and critical problem of the relation between production and exchange. How can we resolve this difficulty? On the one hand, value and abstract labor must already exist in the process of production. And on the other hand, Marx says in dozens of places that the process of exchange is the precondition for abstract labor. Allow me to quote a few examples. I should like to come back to Franklin. Marx says, quote, "But since he does not explain that the labor contained in exchange value is abstract universal social labor, which is brought about by the universal alienation of individual labor, etc. Franklin's main mistake, consequently, was that he disregarded the fact that abstract labor arises from the alienation of individual labor. This is not a question of an isolated comment by Marx. We will show that in the later editions of Capital, Marx increasingly stressed the idea that in commodity production, only exchange reduces concrete labor to abstract labor. To return to our earlier comments, quote, "Hence, when we bring the products of our labor into relation with each other as values, it is not because we see in these articles the material receptacles of homogeneous human labor. Quite the contrary. Whenever, by an exchange, we equate as values our different products, by that very act, we also equate as human labor the very different kinds of labor expended upon them." End quote. Capital 1, page 74. In the first edition of Capital, this sentence had a completely opposite meaning. Marx wrote, quote, When we bring our products into relation with each other as values, to the extent that we see these articles only as material receptacles of homogeneous human labor, end quote, etc. In the second edition, Marx altered the sense of this sentence completely, fearing that he would be understood to mean that we consciously assimilate our labor as abstract labor in advance. And he emphasized the aspect that the equation of labor as abstract labor only occurs through the exchange of the products of labor. This is a significant change between the first edition and the second. As you will know, Marx did not confine himself to the second edition of the first volume of Capital. He corrected the text subsequently for the French edition of 1875 and wrote that he was making corrections which he was not able to make in the second German edition. On this basis, Marx can assign to the French edition of Capital an independent scientific value equal to the German original. In the second edition of Capital, we find the famous phrase, quote, "The equalization of the most different kinds of labor can be the result only of an abstraction from their inequalities, or of reducing them to their common denominator vis-a-vis the expenditure of human labor power or human labor in the abstract," end quote. Capital. In the French edition, Marx replaces the full stop at the end of this sentence with a comma and adds, quote, "and only exchange produces this reduction, by bringing the products of the most diverse kinds of labor into relation with each other on an equal footing," end quote. This insertion is highly indicative and shows clearly how far removed Marx was from the physiological conception of abstract labor. How can we reconcile these observations by Marx, of which there are dozens, with the basic thesis that value is created in production? This should not be too difficult. The point is that the comrades who discussed the problem of the relationship between exchange and production did not, in my view, distinguish sufficiently clearly between the two concepts of exchange. We have to distinguish exchange as social form of the reproduction process from exchange as particular phase of this reproduction process, which alternates with the phase of direct production. At first glance, exchange seems to be a separate phase in the process of reproduction. We can see that a process first takes place in direct production and then is followed by the phase of exchange. Here exchange is separate from production. Here exchange is separate from production and counterposed to production. But exchange is not only a separate phase in the process of reproduction. Exchange stamps the whole process of reproduction with its specific mark and represents a particular social form of the social process of production. Production based on private exchange. Marx frequently characterized commodity production with these words. To make this point clearer, I will quote Marx's words from the third volume of the Theories of Surplus Value, that, quote, "Exchange of products as commodities is a method of exchanging labor. It demonstrates the dependence of the labor of each upon the labor of the others, and corresponds to a certain mode of social labor or social production," end quote. Theories of Surplus Value, Volume 3, page 129. Here, too, we find a statement which explains why Marx regarded exchange as a social form of labor. Quote, "The whole economic structure of society revolves around the form of labor, In other words, the form in which the worker appropriates his means of subsistence. End quote. Theories of surplus value. Let us ask now in exactly what form the laborer acquires his means of subsistence in commodity production. We repeatedly find the following answer to this question in Marx. In commodity production, the only form of appropriation of products is the form of their alienation, and because the form of appropriation of products is the form of social labor, so alienation, exchange, is a determined form of social labor which characterizes commodity production. If one takes into consideration that exchange is the social form of the production process itself, the form which stamps its mark and on the course of the production process itself, then many of Marx's statements become completely clear. When Marx constantly reiterates that abstract labor only results from exchange, he means that it is the result of a given social form of the production process. Labor only takes the form of abstract labor, and the products of labor the form of values, to the extent that the production process assumes the social form of commodity production, i.e., production based on exchange. Thus, exchange is the form of the whole production process, or the form of social labor. As soon as exchange really became the dominant form of the production process, it also stamped its mark on the phase of direct production. In other words, since today is not the first day of production, since a person produces after he has entered into the act of exchange and before it also, the process of direct production also assumes determined social characteristics, which correspond to the organization of commodity production based on exchange. Even when the commodity producer is still in his workshop and is not yet entered into a relationship of exchange with members of the society, he already feels the pressure of all those people who enter the market as his customers, competitors or people who buy from his competitors, and ultimately pressure from all the members of the society. This link through production and these production relations, which are directly regulated in exchange, continue to be effective even after the specific concrete acts of exchange have ceased. They stamp a clear social mark both on the individual and on the individual's labor and the product of his labor. Already in the very process of direct production itself, the producer appears as producer of commodities. His labor assumes the character of abstract labor, and the product assumes the character of value. Here it is necessary to guard against a mistake which is made by many comrades. Many think that because the process of direct production already has a particular social characteristic, the products of labor, and labor in the phase of direct production, must also possess precisely these social characteristics which they possess in the phase of exchange. Such an assumption is totally false. Even though both phases, production and exchange, are closely connected to each other, nevertheless the phase of production does not become the phase of exchange. There is not only a certain similarity between the two phases, there is still a certain distinction too. In other words, on the one hand, We recognize that from the moment when exchange becomes the dominant form of social labor, and people produce specifically for exchange, that is, in the phase of direct production, the character of products of labor can already be regarded as values. But the characteristic of the products of labor as values is not yet that which they assume when they are in fact exchanged for money, when in Marx's terms, quote, the ideal value has become transformed into the, quote, real value, and the social form of the commodity is replaced by the social form of money. The same is also true of labor. We know that commodity owners in their acts of production take the state of the market and of demand into account during the process of direct production, and from the start produce exclusively in order to transform their product into money, and thus also transform their private and concrete labor into social and abstract labor. But this inclusion of the labor of the individual in the labor mechanism of the whole society is only preliminary and tentative. It is still subject to a strict test in the process of exchange, which can give positive or negative results for a particular commodity producer. Thus, the labor activity of the commodity producers in the phase of production is directly private, and concrete labor, and only indirectly, or latently, as Marx put it, social labor. Thus, when we read Marx's work, and particularly his description of the way in which exchange influences value and abstract labor, we must always ask what Marx had in mind in a particular case. Exchange is a form of production process itself, or exchange is a separate phase counterposed to the phase of production. Insofar as exchange as a form of the production process is concerned, Marx distinctly says that without exchange there is neither abstract labor nor value, that labor only assumes the character of abstract labor with the development of exchange. Marx's views are quite clear, and I have developed them in my book. Where Marx refers to exchange as a separate phase counterposed to the phase of production, he says that labor and the product of labor possess a determined social character even before the process of exchange, but that this character must yet be realized in the process of exchange. In the process of direct production, labor is not yet abstract labor in the full sense of the word, but still has to become abstract labor. Numerous statements to this effect can be found in Marx's work. I should like to quote just two passages from the Critique. Quote, "But the different kinds of individual labor represented in these particular use values, in fact, become labor in general. And in this way, social labor, only by actually being exchanged for another in quantities which are proportional to the labor time contained in them." End quote. Elsewhere, Marx writes, quote, "Commodities now confront one another in a dual form, really as use values and nominally as exchange values. They represent now for one another the dual form of labor contained in them, since the particular concrete labor actually exists as their use value, while universal abstract labor time assumes an imaginary existence in their prices." End quote. A critique of political economy. Marx maintains that commodities and money do not lose their differences because of the fact that every commodity must unconditionally be transformed into money. Each is in reality what the other is ideally, and ideally what the other is in reality. All Marx's writing on this show that we must not approach this problem too linearly. We should not think that because commodity producers are already linked to one another by determined social relations in the process of direct production, therefore their products and their labor already possess a directly social character. The labor of a commodity producer is directly private and concrete labor. But together with this, it acquires an additional, quote, ideal or, quote, latent characteristic as abstract, universal, and social labor. Marx was always amused by the utopians who dreamed of the disappearance of money and believed in the dogma that the private labor of private individuals contained in a commodity is immediately social labor. Sorry, that was a quote. I forgot to put the quotation marks, so I'm going to repeat it. Marx was always amused by the utopians who dreamed of the disappearance of money and believed in the dogma that, quote, the private labor of a private individual contained in a commodity is immediately social labor, end quote. We thus come to these conclusions. Abstract labor and value are created or, quote, come about or, quote, become in the process of direct production. Marx used the expression werden more frequently for this process and are only realized in the process of exchange. We have spoken up till now of abstract labor. I should now like to move on to value. Our task is the same in regard to the problem of value as it was with abstract labor. I tried to show that within the concept of abstract labor, we must also include the characteristic of the social organization of labor and commodity production. In the same way, I should like to show that within the concept of value, we must necessarily include the social form of value, the social form which the products of labor assume in commodity production. The task which lies before us is to introduce social form into the concept of abstract labor and the concept of value. How is value usually defined as distinct from exchange value? If we take the most popular and widespread conceptions, we can certainly say that value is usually understood as the labor which must necessarily be expended for the production of a particular commodity. The exchange value of a particular commodity is understood as the other product or sum of money for which a particular commodity is exchanged. If a particular table was produced in 3 hours' labor and is exchanged for 3 chairs, then one usually says that the value of the table is equal to 3 hours of labor and finds its expression in another product which is different from the table itself, that is, these 3 chairs. The 3 chairs represent the exchange value of the table. In this kind of popular definition, it is usually unclear whether the value is determined by the labor or whether the value is the labor itself. Naturally, from the standpoint of Marx's theory, it is correct to say that value is determined by labor. But then the question arises, what is this value, which is determined by labor? We cannot usually find any adequate answer to this in popular scientific explanations. Hence, the readers form the impression that the value of a product is nothing other than the labor which must be expended in its production. The deceptive impression of the complete identity of labor with value is created. This idea is very widespread in anti-Marxist literature. One can say that the majority of the misunderstandings and misinterpretations which we come across in anti-Marxist literature rest on the false assumption that for Marx, labor is also value. This false impression frequently arises from the lack of understanding of the terminology and train of thought in Marx's work. For instance, Marx's famous work that value is congealed or crystallized labor usually construed to mean that labor is also value. This misconception is fostered by the ambiguity of the Russian verb for represent. Darstellen. It's the German version of represent. Value, quote, represents labor. But the Russian translation can be read not only as meaning that value is the representative or expression of labor, the only conception which is consistent with Marx's theory, but also as meaning that value is labor. This idea is very widespread in the critical literature directed against Marx and is obviously wrong. The critics who interpret Marx's statement that labor constitutes the substance of value to mean the complete identity of the two concepts. The critics who interpret Marx's statements that labor constitutes the substance of value to mean the complete identity of the two concepts do not notice the fact that in this case Marx borrowed Hegel's terminology. Anyone who knows Hegel's logic with the theory of essence will remember that Hegel uses various terms when he attempted to clarify the relationship between two objects, one which determines and one which is to be determined. He first says that an object appears as the essence of the other. Then he defines it as the ground for the latter object. Next he describes it as content, as distinct from form. Excuse me, let me back up for a second. Hegel first says that an object appears as the essence of the other. He then defines it as the ground for the latter object. Next he describes it as content, as distinct from form. Later he regards this same object as substance, as cause, and finally he moves on to consider the interrelation between two objects. It is an interesting fact that in Marx's works, the whole scale of expression which we meet in Hegel can be found now applied to labor. Labor is also described as the essence of value, as value's ground, value's content, value's substance, and value's cause. We have to link all these expressions with the methodological principles on which Hegel's theory is based. And it then becomes clear that Marx's thesis that labor is the substance of value can in no way be interpreted to mean the complete identity of the two. In my book, I advanced the particular thesis in the chapter on the content and form of value. I was mainly trying to show that labor is only substance of value, but does not yet represent value. In other words, Marx's critics say that, quote, in Marx's writings, the substance of value is labor, consequently labor is value, end quote. It must be emphasized that labor is only substance of value, and that in order to obtain value in the full sense of the word, we have to add something to labor as the substance of value, namely the social form of value. Only then do we obtain the concept of value in the sense in which it is found in Marx's work. What then does value represent as the unity of the content or substance, i.e. labor, and form of value? What is this value as distinct from exchange for Marx? To find an answer to this problem, we have to ask the question, How does Marx move from exchange value to value? Why does he find it necessary to form a new and more abstract concept of value, in conjunction with exchange value, which appears in reality in the act of exchange? You will probably know that Marx had not yet made any clear distinction between exchange value and value in the Critique of Political Economy. In the Critique, Marx begins his interpretation with exchange value, and from there passes on to value, which he calls exchange value. This transition is entirely imperceptible, smooth, and apparently self-evident. In Capital, Marx makes this transition completely differently, and it is very interesting to compare the first 2 pages of the Critique with those of Capital. The first 2 pages in both books correspond completely. In both alike, the exposition begins with use value and moves on to exchange value. The sentence that exchange value at first sight presents itself as a quantitative relation as proportion is found in both books, but from then on the texts begin to diverge, which, while Marx passes imperceptibly from exchange value to value in the Critique, in Capital the opposite is the case. As if he intends to linger on this point, foreseeing the objections from his opponents. After the sentence mentioned above, Marx comments, hence exchange value appears to be something accidental and purely relative, and consequently an intrinsic value, i.e. an exchange value that is inseparably connected with, inherent in commodities, seems a contradiction in terms. End quote. Let us take a closer look. As we can see, Marx had in mind an adversary who wanted to prove that nothing exists beyond relative values, that the concept of value in political economy is utterly superfluous. Who was the adversary to whom Marx was referring? Dude, I'm so fucking smart because I knew it was Samuel Bailey, and I'm a genius. My intellect cannot be questioned or topped. I'm alpha. I would rather not commit myself so precisely, but I assume that this adversary was Bailey, who tried to prove that the concept of value in general is unnecessary in political economy, and that we should confine ourselves to the observation and investigation of particular proportions in which the various commodities are exchanged. Bailey met with great success with his superficial but witty critique of Ricardo, and attempted to undermine the foundations of the labor theory of value. Bailey maintained that we cannot speak of the value of a table, but that we can only say that the table is exchanged for 3 chairs on one occasion, for 2 pounds of coffee on another occasion, etc. The magnitude of the value of the table is purely relative and varies in different cases. From this, Bailey drew the conclusion which led him to deny the concept of value, where the concept of value differs from the relative value of a particular product in a given act of exchange. Let us imagine the following case. The value of a table is equal to 3 chairs. After a year, this table is exchanged for 6 chairs. We think we can say that although the exchange value of the table has altered, its value has remained unchanged. Only the value of the chairs has fallen to half their former value. Bailey finds this assertion meaningless. If the chair's relation of exchange to the table has changed, then the table's relation of exchange to the chairs has changed, and the value of the table consists only in this. In order to refute Bailey's theory, Marx thought it necessary to develop the thesis that we cannot understand exchange value unless exchange value is traced back to the underlying unity of value. The first section of the first chapter of Capital is devoted to establishing a basis for this idea of making the transition from exchange value to value, and from value to the unity which lies behind it, to labor. The second section is an extension of the first, in that it simply explains the concept of labor in more detail. We can say that Marx makes the transition from the diversity which is observable in the sphere of exchange values to the underlying unity behind all exchange values, that is, to value and ultimately to labor. Here Marx demonstrates the incorrectness of Bailey's conception of the possibility of confining our investigation to the sphere of exchange value. In the third section, Marx retraces the journey and explains how the unity of value of a specific product is expressed in its various exchange values. Previously, Marx had moved from diversity to unity. Now he moves from unity to difference. Earlier, Marx refuted Bailey's theory. Now he supplements Ricardo's theory, in which the transition from value to exchange value was missing. To refute Bailey's theory, Marx had to develop Ricardo's theory further. In fact, Bailey's intention of proving that no value exists except exchange value is made easier by the one-sidedness of Ricardo, who could not show why value appears in a determined form of value. Marx was therefore confronted with two tasks: to prove that behind exchange value, we have to discover value, and to prove that value leads necessarily to different forms of value's manifestation, to exchange value. In this present lecture, I should like to deal only with the former task, as it is my concern to clarify the concept of value. A complete elucidation of the concept of exchange value and money would take me beyond the confines of my theme. Time for a drink. How then does Marx make the transition from exchange value to value? Critics and commentators on Marx usually suppose that his main argument consisted in the well-known comparison of corn and iron, on the third page of the first volume of Capital. When one equates corn and iron, Marx concludes, then there exists in equal quantities something common to both. The two things must be equal to a third, and this third thing is their value. This is usually thought to constitute Marx's central argument, and the critical blows of his adversaries are usually directed against this argument. There is no work hostile to Marx which does not make some reference to Marx's attempt to prove the necessity of the concept of value by purely abstract analysis. But they completely overlooked this fact. The paragraph which deals with the comparison of corn with iron is no more than a conclusion following on from the previous paragraph, which is usually disregarded not only by the critics, but by commentators on Marx also. The previous paragraph reads, quote, a given commodity, for example, a quarter of wheat is exchanged for 20 pounds of blacking, 1.5 meters of silk, or 1.5 ounce of gold, etc. In short, for other commodities in the most different proportions. But the exchange value of the quarter of wheat remains unchanged, and is expressed only in the blacking, the silk, and the gold. Consequently, the exchange value must contain something distinguishable from these phenomenal forms. End quote. Capital. Marx worked on this paragraph with care and gave different variations in various editions. We quoted the passage in the Russian translation of the German edition, which was edited by Karl Kautsky. We can follow the reasoning even more clearly in the second edition of Capital, where the end of the passage reads, quote, "Since X blacking, Y silk, or Z gold, etc., each represent the exchange value of 1/4 of wheat, X blacking, Y silk, Z gold, etc. must, as exchange values, be replaced by each other or equal to each other. Therefore, first, the valid exchange values of a given commodity express something equal." End quote. Capital. In other words, two commodities which are equal to our given commodity, the wheat, are equal to each other. If we take this conclusion into consideration, as emphasized by Marx in the variations quoted, we can see that the next paragraph follows in logical sequence. It follows from this that one and the same commodity can be expressed in the most different use values. In the paragraph quoted, Marx comes to the conclusion that two commodities, which are exchanged for one and the same commodity, are equal to a third, are equal to one another. From this follows also with logical necessity the converse conclusion, which Marx reaches in the next paragraph. If two commodities are equal to one another, then they are equal to a third. It is this thought which Marx expresses in the paragraph where he compares the wheat with the iron. Thus Marx's thesis that two commodities which are equal to one another must always be equal to any third is simply a logical conclusion of the previous thesis, according to which two commodities which are equal to a third are equal to each other. The true sense of Marx's argumentation consists in the statement of a well-known fact about commodity production. The fact that commodities can be equated with each other and that a specific commodity can be assimilated with infinite numbers of other commodities. In other words, it is the concrete structure of commodity production which forms the starting point of all Marx's reflections and in no way the purely logical comparison of two commodities. Marx thus starts out from the fact of the universal equalization of all commodities with each other, or from the fact that every commodity can be compared with a vast number of other commodities. Nevertheless, this assumption alone is inadequate for all the conclusions Marx draws. There is another tacit assumption underlying these which Marx expressed elsewhere. The second assumption consists in this. We assume that the exchange of 1/4 of wheat for any other commodity is an exchange which is governed by a known regularity. Gesetzmäßigkeit. And the regularity of these acts of exchange is due to their dependence on the process of production. We have to reject the notion that the 1/4 of wheat can be exchanged for any random quantity of iron, coffee, etc. We cannot agree with the assumption that the proportions of exchange are laid down each time in the act of exchange itself, and so have a completely accidental character. We maintain that all these possibilities for the exchange of a specific commodity with another are governed by a determined regularity which is based in the process of production. In this case, Marx's whole argument takes the following form. Marx says, let us take not the accidental exchange of two commodities, wheat and iron, but exchange in the form in which it actually occurs in commodity production. And then we will see that each object can be universally equated with all other objects. In other words, we can observe countless numbers of proportions of exchange of a given product with all others. But the proportions of the exchange are not accidental. They are regular, and their regularity is determined by causes which are grounded in the process of production. Thus we reach the conclusion that independently of the fact that the value of a quarter of wheat is expressed on one occasion as 2 pounds of coffee, on another as 3 chairs, etc., the value of a quarter of wheat remains one and the same in all the different cases. If we were to assume that a quarter of wheat has a different value in each of the infinite number of proportions of exchange, and Bailey's assertion amounts to this, then we would be acknowledging that complete chaos reigns in the phenomenon of price formation, in that sublime phenomenon of exchange of products, through and by means of which a universal interrelation of all modes of labor is established. We can draw certain conclusions from the train of thought which led Marx from exchange value to value. I came to one conclusion earlier. When I referred to the fact that Marx makes commodity production with its universal equation of all products the starting point of his inquiry, an equation which is closely connected with the course of the production process. Marx does not set out from the contrived example of a random comparison of two commodities, nor from a purely logical analysis of all the characteristics which they may have in common, but from the real form of the exchange of products which is characteristic of commodity production. Our second conclusion comes down to this. When Marx compares wheat with iron, he finds in both something common, and in this common factor, he recognizes the value of the products. In the popular literature, one cannot find a clear answer to the question as to what the common factor in the exchangeable products to which Marx refers. Sometimes is correctly seen as value, sometimes though it is identified with labor. If we turn to Marx, we find a clear answer to the question on the 5th page of Capital. Therefore, the common substance that manifests itself in the exchange value of commodities, whenever they are exchanged, is the commodity's value. Therefore, the common substance that manifests itself in the exchange value of commodities, whenever they are exchanged, is their value. Marx, therefore, does not move directly from exchange value to labor. From exchange value, he moves to the concept of value, and then only to further analysis. From the concept of value to labor. Strictly speaking, there are 3 stages in the chain of reasoning as it moves from exchange value to value and from value to labor. The conclusion I should like to draw from this comes down to the fact that which we discussed previously, that the concept of value must be strictly distinguished from the concept of labor. Although there is a tendency, particularly in popular interpretations, to explain them as identical. But what then is this value, which we obtained by abstraction from the concrete proportions of exchange value, in which our quarter of wheat is equated with other products? Although we are now abstracting from those concrete products for which our quarter of wheat is exchanged, nevertheless we do not abstract from the social form of value. Let me repeat that sentence. Although we are now abstracting from those concrete products for which our quarter of wheat is exchanged, nevertheless we do not abstract from the social form of value which this quarter of wheat possesses. That is, we hold that our quarter of wheat has the capacity to be exchanged in a determined proportion for any other product which exists in the particular society. Further, we consider the product's capacity for exchange to be its characteristic feature, which is subjected to determined laws, and is in particular closely linked with the conditions of manufacture of a specific product. In other words, no longer does the concept of the social labor necessary for its production alone form part of our concept of the value of wheat. The concept of social labor, which assumes, quote, material form, the form of a particular property of a product, is also included together with the, quote, content of value and the, quote, form of value. I should like to give one quotation to show that Marx distinguishes value from labor as the content of value. Quote, "Every product of labor is, in all states of society, a use value. But it is only at a definite historical epoch in a society's development that such a product becomes a commodity. Viz., at the epoch when the labor spent on the product of a useful article becomes expressed as one of the objective qualities of that article, i.e., as its value." End quote. Capital. Thus, the content of value, i.e., labor, and the social form of value are also included in the concept of value. What then is this form of value, which is distinct from exchange value, is a part of the concept of value itself? I should like to give one very clear definition of the form of value from the first edition of Capital. Quote, "The social form of the commodity and the form of value, or form of exchangeability, are therefore one and the same." End quote. As may be seen, the form of value is the description of the form of exchangeability, or the social form of the product of labor, which contains the capacity to be exchanged for any other commodities, insofar as this capacity is determined by the quantity of labor necessary for the production of a specific commodity. In this way, we did not depart from the social form of the product of labor when we made the transition from exchange value to value. We have only abstracted from that concrete product in which the value of the commodity is expressed. But we never lost sight of the social form of the product of labor. Our conclusion can also be formulated thus. Marx analyzes the form of value separately from exchange value. In order to introduce the social form of the product of labor in the concept of value itself, we were forced to split or divide the social form of the product of labor into two forms, into the form of value and into exchange value. The former meaning the social form of the product which is not yet concretized in a specific object, but represents, as it were, the abstract character of a commodity. I have also explained this distinction between the form of value and exchange value in my book. There I consider them both as qualitative and quantitative aspects, There I've considered them both as qualitative and quantitative aspects of exchange value. It is true. I did this mainly because in some places in Marx's work, the term form of value and exchange value are scarcely distinguished from one another. A complete identification of the form of value with the qualitative aspects and of exchange value with the quantitative cannot be regarded as correct, since both concepts must be considered both from their qualitative as well as from their quantitative side. The question does not bear directly on our theme, and I will therefore not spend any more time on it. I will simply note that this division of the social form of the product into the form of value and exchange value is extensively dealt with in my book. I had to introduce the characteristics of the social form of the product of labor into the concept of value itself, and thus demonstrate the inadmissibility of an identification of the concept of value with the concept of labor, an identification frequently made by popular scientific interpretations of Marx's theory. In other words, I had to demonstrate that value arises not only from the substance of value, i.e. labor, but also from the form of value, and in order to introduce the form of value into the concept of value itself. I had to distinguish it from exchange value, which Marx considers separately from value. I had to divide the social form of the product into two parts, into social form which has not yet acquired a concrete appearance, and into that form which has already acquired a concrete and independent character. Now that the distinction between the form of value and exchange value has been clarified, I should like to turn to the concept of value and develop the relationship between its various aspects, the content or substance of value and the form of value. What relation exists between labor and that social form of value with which we have dealt? The general answer to this question runs: the form of value is the adequate and exact form of the expression of what is contained in value, i.e. labor. In order to explain this idea, we must come back to an earlier example. A table is exchanged for 3 chairs. We say that this process of exchange is subject to a determined regularity and dependent on the development of and the alterations in the productivity of labor. But exchange value is a social form of the product, which not only expresses the alterations in the labor, but also conceals and obscures these very changes. It obscures them for the simple reason that exchange value is the relation between 2 commodities, between the table and the chairs, and therefore the alteration of the proportions of exchange between these 2 articles gives us no information about whether the labor expended on the making of the table has actually altered. If the table can be exchanged for 6 chairs, some time has elapsed, then the exchange value of the table is altered, while the value of the table itself may not have changed 1 iota. In order to examine the process whereby the change in the social form of the product depends on the quantity of labor expended in its making, in its pure form, Marx had to separate the phenomenon as it exists into 2 parts. He had to cut it across and say that we must study separately those causes which determine the value of the table and those which determine the value of the chairs, and that one and the same phenomenon of exchange, the fact that the table can now be exchanged for 6 chairs instead of for 3, can either be caused by reasons connected with the table or by reasons stemming from the conditions of the production of chairs. To examine the activity of each of these causal chains separately, Marx had to split the fact of the exchange and the exchange value of the table into 2 parts and assume that these changes are exclusively caused by reasons effective on the side of the table, i.e. through a change in the production of the labor necessary for the production of the table. In other words, he had to assume that all the other commodities from which our table is exchanged maintain their original value. Only on this assumption does the change in the value of the table follow from the change in the quantity of labor necessary for its production. And the social form of labor proves to be a more precise and adequate expression of the content of value or the substance of value, that is, of the quantity of labor expended in the process of production. The determination of value as unity of content, i.e. labor and social form of value, carries the following advantages. We can break with the widespread identification of value with labor straight away, and so determine the relation of the concept of value to the concepts of labor more correctly. On the other hand, we can also determine the relation between value and exchange value more correctly. Formerly, when value was regarded simply as labor and had not yet assumed more precise social characteristics, this value was on the one hand identified with labor, and on the other hand separated from exchange value by an abyss. Economists often saw only labor in the concept of value and could not make the transition from this concept to the concept of exchange value. Now, regarding value as the unity of content and form, we link value through its content with the preceding concept, with labor. On the other hand, though, we link the concept of value through the form of value with what follows, with exchange value. In fact, when we maintain that value is not labor in general, but labor which has assumed the form of the exchangeability of the product, then we necessarily have to make the transition from value to exchange value. Thus, the concept of value is inseparably linked with, on the one hand, the concept of labor, and on the other, with the concept of exchange value. But the inseparable connection of all these concepts should not lead to their identification with each other. We regard value as social labor, which has assumed the form of an objectified property of the product of labor, or as the property of the product to be able to be exchanged for any other product, insofar as this property of the product depends on the quantity of social labor necessary for its production. In conclusion, I should like to point out that the ability to split the social form of the product into two parts, the form of value and exchange value, the former itself belongs to the concept of value, while exchange value is only a phenomenal form of value. Possibly recalls an analogous procedure in Hegel's writing. Although Marx does not refer anywhere to a connection between his concept and Hegel's philosophy, one can find an essential similarity between the division of the social form in Marx's work and Hegel's theory of the doubling of the form. I should like to quote a few lines from the so-called small logic by Hegel. Quote, "The essential point to keep in mind about the exposition of form and content is that the content is not formless, but has the form in its own self, quite as much as the form is external to it. There's thus a doubling of form. At one time, form is reflected into itself, and then is identical with the content. At another time, it is not reflected into itself, and then is the external existence, which does not at all affect the content." End quote. Hegel's Minor Logic. I think the distinction Marx made between the form of value, which is included in value itself, and exchange value, which represents something external, undetermined in relation to value, bears some similarity with the doubling of form which we find in Hegel. I now come to the last part of my lecture, which concerns the question of the content or the substance of value. All Marxists agree that labor constitutes the content of value. But the problem lies in determining what kind of labor we are speaking of. The previous part of the lecture should have convinced us to the variety of different concepts which can be considered different concepts which can be concealed in the word labor. What kind of labor, therefore, constitutes the content of value? Most readers will have taken me to mean that by the content of value I understand labor in its material technical form. I admit that this interpretation is justified since approximately these formulations may be found in my book, Essays on the Theory of Value. Nonetheless, I must recall that in my book, in the one chapter on content and form of value, one can find not one, but three formulations which could show that by the content of value, I do not mean labor which is studied exclusively from its material technical aspect. There I wrote, quote, "Labor as the substance of value is not seen by Marx as a determined quantity of labor, but as something, quote, independent and absolute, end quote, within the quotation, as something accumulated in the product and materially objectified. This labor is examined from the standpoint of the process of division of social labor among the individual branches of production and taken as part of the total social labor in its relation to the latter as to the whole," end quote. Rubin. Elsewhere, I quoted Marx's words on value as, quote, "form, in which the proportional division of labor is expressed," end quote. Lastly, the final conclusion of the chapter reads, quote, "Considered from the qualitative aspect, the relation between labor as substance of value and form of value signifies the relation between the process of division of labor and its specific social and exchange form," end quote. These references should justify my conclusion that I did not take the content of value to mean labor considered exclusively from the material technical side. Rather, my conception approximated to the concept of equally socially equated and divided labor discussed earlier. But this concept, which can be found in many places in my book, was not adequately explained and needed important corrections. In the present lecture, I have drawn a sharp distinction between socially equated labor in general, which exists not only in commodity production, but also, for example, in socialism, and abstract universal labor as labor which is equated in the specific form appropriate to commodity production. Let us now ask, does Marx understand the content of value to mean socially equated labor in general, or abstract universal labor? In other words, when we refer to labor as the content of value, do we include in the concept of labor all those characteristics which we incorporated above in the concept of abstract labor? Or do we conceive of labor in the sense of socially equated labor, which does not incorporate those characteristics which characterize the social organization of labor in commodity production? Does the concept of labor as the content of value coincide with the concept of abstract labor which constitutes value? Or is the character of the former concept broader than this? At first glance, one can find arguments in favor of both interpretations of the content of value in Marx's writing. writings, plural. On the one hand, one can find arguments which apparently mean that by labor, as the content of value, we should understand something more limited than abstract labor. That is, labor without all those social characteristics which appertain to it in commodity production. What arguments can we find to support the solution to the problem? Marx often meant by content of value something which can not only acquire the social form of value, but another social form too. Content is understood as something which is capable of assuming different social forms. It is precisely this ability which distinguishes socially equated labor, but not abstract labor, i.e., labor which has already assumed a definite social form. Socially equated labor can assume the form of labor organized in commodity production, and the form of labor organized in, for instance, a socialist economy. In other words, in this case, we are conceiving of socially equalized labor in its abstract form and disregarding those modifications which are brought about in the content itself, i.e., labor, by one or another of its forms. Does this concept of the content of value exist in this sense in Marx's work? We can now answer this question positively. Think, for example, of the passage where Marx says that, quote, exchange value is a definite social manner of expressing the amount of labor bestowed upon an object, end quote. Labor is clearly being considered as abstract content here, which can assume either one or another social form. When Marx writes in his well-known letter to Kugelmann on the 11th of July, 1868, that the social division of labor manifests itself in commodity production in the form of value, he is again regarding socially divided labor as the content which can assume this or that social form. In the second paragraph of the section on the fetishism of commodities, Marx explains directly that we can find the, quote, content of the determining factors of value, end quote. Not only in commodity production, but for example in a patriarchal family, or on a medieval estate. Here, as we see, labor represents a content which can assume various social forms. We may now put forward an argument in favor of the opposing thesis, according to which we have to see abstract labor as the content of value. Firstly, we find a few statements by Marx confirming this. For example, quote, commodities relate to abstract human labor as their common social substance, end quote. This statement leaves no room for doubt that abstract labor is not only a creator of value, but also substance of value or content of value. The same conclusions may be reached on the basis of methodological considerations. I demonstrated earlier that in commodity production, socially equalized labor assumes the form of abstract labor, and value as the social form of the products of labor arises necessarily only from this abstract labor. It follows from this that the concept of abstract labor directly precedes the concept of value in our system. And that would show that we must interpret precisely this concept of abstract labor as the basis, content, or substance of value. But one must also not forget that in the question of the relation between content and form, Marx took not Kant's but Hegel's standpoint. Kant regarded form as something external in relation to content and as something which joins onto content from the outside. From the standpoint of Hegelian philosophy, content does not represent something which form attaches to from the outside. Rather, the content itself, in its development, gives birth to this form, which was contained within the content in concealed form. The form arises necessarily from the content itself. This is the main thesis of Hegelian and Marxist methodology, a thesis which stands in contradiction to Kantian methodology. From this standpoint, the form of value also must arise of necessity from the substance of value, and consequently we must view abstract labor as the substance of value in all the fullness of its social features which are characteristic for commodity production. Finally, for our last argument, we will point out that when we take abstract labor as the content of value, an essential simplification of the whole Marxist system is achieved, since in this case labor as content of value is not distinguished from the labor which creates value. So we have reached the paradoxical conclusion that at one point Marx acknowledges socially equalized labor as the content of value, and at another he acknowledged abstract labor as this content. How can we resolve this contradiction? It seems to me that the contradiction disappears if we remember the distinction between the two methods, the analytical and the dialectical, which I discussed at the beginning of my lecture. If we set out from value as a determined social form and ask ourselves, what is the content of this form? It will become apparent that this form only expresses the fact in general that social labor was expended. Value proves to be form, which expresses the fact of the social equation of labor as a fact which not only occurs in commodity production, but can also occur in other kinds of production. Forgive me, I know it's disgusting. Bit of a cold. If we set out from value as a determined social form and ask ourselves, what is the content of this form? It will become apparent that this form only expresses the fact in general that social labor was expended. Value proves to be form, which expresses the fact of the social equation of labor as a fact which not only occurs in commodity production, but can also occur in other kinds of production. By proceeding analytically from the finished form to its content, we have found socially equated labor as the content of value. But we reach another conclusion when we take not the finished form as starting point, but the content itself, i.e. labor, from which the form value must necessarily arise. In order to make the transition from labor regarded as content to value as form, we have to include the concept of labor, in the concept of labor, the social form of labor's organization in commodity production, i.e. recognize abstract universal labor as the content of value. It is possible that the apparent contradiction in the definition of the content of value in Marx's work can be explained precisely by the distinction between these two methods. If we now summarize the interpretation discussed in our lecture, we can say that the following 5 concepts are the basic concepts on which Marxian theory of value and money rests. 1. The relations of production of the commodity producers. 2. Abstract labor. 3. Value. 4. Exchange value. And 5. Money. Engels pointed out in his article on Marx's critique of political economy that Marx's contribution consists in showing us the whole system of the bourgeois economy and its interrelations. Applied to these 5 categories, Marx's contribution consists in showing the inseparable interrelation between all these categories. Finally, this interrelation was frequently lost sight of by readers of Marx, and these categories were each considered separately. Let us recollect how the relationship between the 5 categories has usually been envisaged. Let us begin with the relation of production of the commodity producers. This concept was known to all Marxists. It was generally known that the theory of the production relations between people is the basis of Marxian economic theory. But no one made sufficient attempts to show clearly how these categories arose from people's production relations. There was therefore a complete break between the first and second concepts when we made the transition to abstract labor. Abstract labor was defined as physiologically equal labor. That is, the form of the production relations between people as commodity producers has been completely dismissed. We forgot this form and suddenly found ourselves in the sphere of physiologically equal labor, which is the same in all historical epochs. Making the transition from the concept of abstract labor to the concept of value, it must be said that these 2 concepts were always closely connected in Marxist literature. It would actually be very strange if the adherents to the labor theory of value did not link the concept of labor with the concept of value. But this connection was paid for very dearly in that value was almost identified with labor, and it was not clear in what way value is actually distinguished from labor. There was a break again in the next transition from value to exchange value. Value was identified with labor, and so we did not know how exchange value arises from value either. Lastly, the relation between the concept of exchange and the concept of money was always very consistent in Marxist literature, already since Marx emphasized this relation and substantiated it in particular. Thus, the 5 categories we listed were split up into 3 groups. In the first group were the production relations of commodity producers, in the second, abstract labor and value, and in the third, exchange value and money. The system was only interrupted in 2 places, at the point where we have to move from the relations of production to abstract labor, and then again from value to exchange value. These interruptions disappear when we regard abstract labor as labor which possesses a determined social form, and value as the unity of content and form. Through these 2 reformulations, we now obtain an uninterrupted logical interrelation of all the categories listed. A determined form of the production relations of people. Through these 2 reformulations, we now obtain an uninterrupted logical interrelation of all the categories listed. A determined form of the production relations of people as commodity producers gives rise to the concept of abstract labor. From abstract labor in commodity production, viewed not as physiologically equal labor, but as socially equated labor in a specific form, the concept of value emerged of necessity. The concept of value, considered as unity of content and form, is linked through its content with the preceding concept of abstract labor, and through its form with the following concept of exchange value. Finally, the development of exchange value leads to necessity to value. Exchange leads of necessity to value. Finally, the development of exchange leads of necessity. Finally, the development of exchange leads of necessity to value. It would be contrary to my intention if the interrelation between these categories appeared as some logical self-progression of concepts, which give rise to one another. The close interrelation of the concepts which follow on from one another logically is explained by the fact that all these concepts are built up from the concept of the relations of production between people as commodity producers. This concept conceals a multitude of real social relations between people which consistently conflict and develop uninterruptedly. The economic categories express, quote, forms of existence, determinations of existence, often just individual aspects of this given society, end quote, Grundrisse. The logical unity of the economic categories is due to the real unity of this society, the actual object of our study. If you made it to the end of this, you should you should say what's up in the comment section. Because maybe I'm just sleepy, but that felt a little long, so I thank you for hanging in there and listening to me. Also, if you I do this all the time, but if you download the MP3 using a YouTube to MP3 website, which I do all the time, you should do what I do when I do that and just give the video a like, so if someone actually knows that you're watching the goddamn thing, because I don't know if anyone's actually listening to anything that I put up when that is done, and so yeah, give it a like so I don't feel like I'm just talking into the wind. But even if I am just talking into the wind, that's perfectly fine, because if only one person listens to it, I feel like I've done a service to the critique of political economy. Thanks for listening.